They've run many accelerators and have over 100 million under management. And they're operating the leading fish farming, aquaculture, news site globally. So I couldn't wish for a better first guest to set the stage of the Regen Aquaculture series. What is aquaculture and why should investors and entrepreneurs care deeply about this space? And why has it been neglected for such a long time? Plus, what does it mean when we apply regenerative principles to water-based farming? So get ready for a literal deep dive into the fascinating world of farming underwater. Take a deep breath. And another one. Every second breath we take comes from the oceans, and over half of the fish we eat is farmed. That's why we dedicate a series to explore the potential of regeneration underwater. Oceans and other water bodies cover most of our planet and have stored most of the excess heat so far, and at the same time have some of the best opportunities to produce healthy food, mostly protein, store carbon, create materials, fuel, biostimulants, and much, much more. Plus, create a lot of jobs in coastal communities. We have largely ignored the water-based farming, aquaculture, industry in this podcast until now. In these conversations, we explore why aquaculture is so important for the future of our planet. If we get this wrong, we have a serious problem. And what are the risks and challenges with feed, the reliance on soy, pests, yes, there are pests underwater, antibiotics, microplastics, etc. What does it mean when you apply regenerative principles to aquaculture? What can soil-based agriculture learn from aquaculture and vice versa? And what should investors really know about water-based farming and what the potential is of regenerative aquaculture? A series of interviews with the people putting money to work, entrepreneurs and investors in this crucial and often overlooked sector. We're grateful for the support of the Nest Family Office in order to make this series. The Nest is a family office dedicated to building a more resilient food system through supporting natural solutions and innovative technologies that change the way we produce food. You can find out more on the Nest FO, that is thenestfo.com, or in the links below. Welcome to another episode. Today, the first one in the Regen Aquaculture, so aquaculture, not agriculture series. And I'm very happy to have the managing partner and co-founder of HatchBlue, a knowledge-driven aquaculture and alternative seafood specialist. Welcome, George.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of the show and excited to be here.
That's amazing. Yeah, we have been talking about this series for a while, and we're very happy to kick it off. With a lot of insights that you have collected over a while now into the seafood space, the aquaculture space, into, let's say, life below water. I think it's an under or a neglected piece of the space, of the food space in general. And we're going to try to unpack it in this series. And we're going to try to unpack it also in this episode. Why is it important? What is aquaculture? Why should we pay attention to it? And all of those good things. But let's start with a personal question we always like to start with at the beginning is why do you spend, or how come you spend most of your, let's say, awake hours, in this case, not focusing on soil, but indirectly actually with aquaculture you do that, but focusing on sea or water. How come you spend most of your awake time looking at that and working in that, investing in that, etc.?
I think it's really twofold. One is it's close to my heart. It's my passion. I grew up unfortunately in landlocked Germany, but I was always a big fan of fishing and keeping pet fish, and that was it for me as a kid, really, like until I hit puberty or so. That was really all I thought about, and I always connected to that. I'm a big fan of the ocean. I love being on the water, being underwater. So that's the passion piece. And then on the other hand, I think the aquaculture industry plays an important role as any food system in the global climate change situation and the crisis we are facing. And so for me, it's really an environmental motivation connected to biodiversity, connected to the changing climate that makes me work in this field.
And let's unpack a bit your background in the space and what is HatchBlue. background. Actually, I met your co-founder Karsten a long time ago when he was interning at Aquaspark back in the day, which we'll talk about as well. So I have a background in the aquaculture space, but more than 10 years ago. So I'm looking forward to take a deep dive, pun intended, back into the space and see the importance and the potential. But what is Hatch? Because that shortly after, I think Karsten co-founded Hatch Blue. So what is Hatch Blue? Great name, by the way, of course, Hatch.blue, which I'll put in the show notes below as well.
So we are, as you already mentioned in introduction, a knowledge-driven firm in the aquaculture and alternative seafood space with 4 main business activities. We invest, so we have 3 different funds or vehicles that we manage. 2 of them are actively investing. Right now, our total AUM is around 100 million euros. Second, we provide consulting services mostly to the industry and big corporates and investors. And thirdly, we run various startup programs across the globe, usually in partnership with governments or sometimes also with industry or philanthropic organizations, where we really try to build the capacity within the ecosystem around building companies. And then lastly, we operate a platform called thefishsite.com, which is a news and media agency.
And in the last, so when did it start? And like how recent this is? I think the 100 million is an amazing accomplishment, especially in a sector that still feels very early, but is sort of is very big. But I think in the general public, not very well known. I think you just closed a 75 million fund recently, so congrats with that. But how long has this journey, let's say, been unfolding?
Now, since 2017, and as you said, Carsten, who worked at Aquaspark and where you met, by the way, he's saying hello. He left Aquaspark back then to start his own firm called Alimentos Ventures. The idea really was to invest in a few different aquaculture-related early-stage projects, from IP licensing to just VC investments. And one of the projects he had been working on was an accelerator for the aquaculture industry. I, through my own thinking, got to the conclusion that there should be something like an accelerator in specifically focusing on aquaculture. And yeah, we met via LinkedIn and had the same ideas, and shortly after met in person and decided that we would work together. Then we also onboarded another an Irish guy called Wayne Murphy. He really had the accelerator expertise, and that was in 2017. And then we launched in early 2018 with an accelerator for the industry, because it was the first one. I think it got good attention, and we got startups from all over the world to join the program. And from there, we really built Hatch Blue. We added funds into it so that we have more capacity to invest in these companies going through the programs. We offered more programs. We professionalized our consulting work that we had already been doing since the very beginning. And then we also acquired the fish site from Benchmark when they were looking to sell it.
And so why the fund side of things, the investment side, next to an accelerator makes sense, I think, from an investment perspective, because you get early access to this stuff. But also, did you feel there wasn't enough money flowing into the space yet? And did you see the companies you were working with were quote unquote struggling to raise, and you said this is a shame? What was the reasoning to start funds in the space beyond that it makes financial sense if you're so close to companies?
Yeah, no, definitely we felt there was a lack of educated capital dedicated to the space. There were investors that overlapped with it in the food and ag space, but they really only occasionally took a look and had 1 or 2 portfolio firms that were actually active in aquaculture. And back then, there weren't any success cases necessarily of larger companies or exits. There weren't the big names like nowadays, like large global investors like Sequoia or Temasek or so really invested in some of these companies. But back then that wasn't the case, and it was fairly niche, and we felt like we need to professionalize that and give more choice to the entrepreneurs also where they raised capital from.
And so the $1 million question, like how difficult was it to get investors into your funds? Like how much education, explaining, etc. did it take? Especially the first one. I mean, this is different now. We're in a different world, but how was that journey with the first one?
Funnily enough, I think the first one was almost a bit easier because it was a fairly small fund. You would probably call it a micro fund of $8.4 million. So really not a large vehicle. We got mostly high net worth individuals and one or two strategics into the fund, and the fundraising still took some time, and it wasn't easy because indeed, you really have to educate investors on the space. What is aquaculture? Fisheries? No, it's not fisheries. Is it the blue economy? Yeah, you can call it that if you want to. Is it food and egg? Yes, if you want to look at it this way, for sure. But I think really the second fund, because we then went from the 8.4 million to targeting a 75 million euro fund, that was a huge step up, and it also required us to raise from a different investor base. We had to change the way we were set up, who we were approaching, and then in the last 1 or 2 years also the fundraising environment changed, not to the better. So that really was a very long period of fundraising where I personally learned a lot about how to fundraise for a fund, where to raise from, like what our value proposition is to those investors. And we still have a very mixed bag of LPs. So we have LPs that are your classic high net worth individual. They have some connection to the industry, up to institutional investors investing 20 million euros in the fund. So it's a wide range, including family offices, foundations, strategic, so industry players. And I think ultimately that's not a good thing. It just shows that you need to go to various different sources to raise a fund in this space.
And so what made you choose to go for like basically almost 10 times the original one? Like 75 is a lot of money in these circumstances of the last 2 years. What was the thinking and reasoning behind it? Of course, you have the deal flow, otherwise you wouldn't raise that amount. But it's quite a step up from 8.4, 8.6.
Yeah, we first of all, we changed the model slightly. So for this larger fund, we didn't invest through the accelerator model anymore. That is still another vehicle that we have that does that. But we really felt like we want to be able to not only invest a few $100,000 into these companies, but a few million euros. And then if you look at this, you need to have a different level of due diligence when the companies come into the fund. You need to have a different middle and back office of how you manage the fund, and you essentially need to professionalize around that. And so there's, I would say, some sort of minimum fund size that you need to have. And on the other hand, we felt like we could even deploy way more than what we currently have, because it's a fairly large industry. There are not many dedicated funds there, and once you figure out that something is working, you can deploy quite a lot into them. So for us, I would call it was a conscious decision to go to larger fund size, but it was, I would say, also a natural evolution of what we were doing.
So now let's unpack the industry of what you mentioned and unpack what is aquaculture, why is it important, why are we talking about it on a podcast on Regen Food. I mean, of course, the food piece, but just to paint a mental picture and a visual image and to get us all on the same page when we talk about this huge industry, but has been not really talked about enough, nor invested in enough, nor like enough entrepreneurs, etc. It feels a bit like Regen Ag, but at least in the Regen Ag space, you can always talk about agriculture that everybody knows. In this case, most people don't even know where most of the fish comes from. So what is aquaculture when you have to explain that, let's say, at a dinner party in Berlin?
Then I would just tell them that whether salmon or whether shrimp comes from is most likely aquaculture. So aquaculture is the farming of aquatic species like salmon, like shrimp, like oysters or seaweed. And mostly it goes into human food. So there are a few cases where aquaculture products are not directly for human food. For example, some seaweeds go into the pharmaceutical or nutraceutical or some chemical industries. But for the most part, it's really a food production sector. And it is, as you mentioned, pretty large. It's estimated to be at 260 billion globally in terms of value, over 120 million tons of total production. And the reasons to me are also quite clear why it's not as commonly known as agriculture, for example. It generally occurs in remote places because it's important what water quality you have to farm these animals. And it's also a much younger industry altogether. It really grew over the last 50 years. So it managed to grow from really being a niche substitute to wild fisheries, to catching wild produced animals, to I would say, true alternative to it, where it surpassed the total production volume of fisheries already. And but still 50 years in terms of the human population is not a whole lot, because we're doing agriculture for, 10,000 years or probably even longer than that.
And so, I mean, you mentioned there in a sort of a side sentence, a fundamental piece, like this is big, this is as big and actually bigger and more than we fish worldwide. So more than half of what we eat in terms of fish or aquatic animals is actually farmed, and in many species it's most of it. And it doesn't seem to be slowing down for different reasons. A big one is that the oceans are under a lot of pressure. The fisheries are under a lot of pressure. We see collapse left and right. Even in mainstream media, we see those images, and it also feels. I always remember at Aquaspark in the past, it feels like this transition of hunter-gatherers to farming, which we've done. We can discuss if that was a good thing or not, but it has happened. Most of what we eat has been farmed now and is not hunted, and somehow we still do that in the sea and in the oceans with detrimental effect in many cases. Yes, there are sustainably managed fisheries, I know, but just look at deep sea trawling. Google that for a second if you want to see some horrific effects. And we see even on the carbon side and on the sea disturbance, like that's basically plowing a rainforest to harvest a few sardines, if you want to compare it to agriculture. So the trends are very strong, and then there's a sector that's been blossoming for the last 50 years with a lot of issues. We'll talk about that, but a huge amount of opportunities as well. So at least we should all know about it, so we can have we can act on it as consumers, as citizens, as eaters, but also definitely as investors and entrepreneurs.
Absolutely.
So just to paint a bit on the farming, you say it's often remote. Can you walk us through or dive us through? Sorry, these pun intended ones are going to get old very soon. But to a few different systems, like what should we imagine when you talk fish farming and also seaweed farming? Like what do we mentally should imagine when we're listening to this? I don't know, driving, cooking, commuting, whatever our listeners are doing now.
While you're cooking your piece of salmon, so there are a few main categories of how these animals are farmed. One is the net pen aquaculture. So this is really you picture a off near the shore, but yeah, obviously in the water, a most of the time circular ring, and it has a net below it. This is where the young animals get stocked into and then fed until they are harvested. And that's the predominant production system, for example, for salmon production in Norway or in Chile. In the case of salmon, it's really, really important that the water quality is right, but also, of course, that you have the right temperature. So this is why salmon is produced in these countries with a long coastline, cold water, high water quality, and also a lot of protected, sheltered areas, because these net pens are not able to be in open, rough water with high currents or high waves. So that's one form of aquaculture production. The second one is pond-based aquaculture, and that is usually near the coast, and it is a built pond. So sometimes they're pure earthen ponds, and sometimes they're lined with plastic to increase a little bit the control on over the environment. And those are filled with water. Often it is seawater, but it can also be fresh water. And then the animals are stocked into these production systems and harvested afterwards. This is, for example, the predominant production system of shrimp aquaculture. You couldn't put a shrimp in a net pen; they really would not like that, and people don't do that. So, net pen aquaculture and pond aquaculture are the dominant production systems, and then there are various forms of additional, often, let's say, more sophisticated ways of producing it, some of which are around have been around for a long time, and some of which are really just being developed over the last couple of years, and often in order to address some of the challenges of the existing production systems.
And where are, I mean, you mentioned salmon, which I think is the most, at least in the, let's say, the global north, the most known piece, not the fish that's most farmed.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of questions and discussions around why we started farming salmon, but that's mostly Chile and Norway, and a bit Ireland, I think, in Scotland. But in general, what are the big, let's say, hotspots for aquaculture in general? Of course, species dependent.
Yeah, really, most of it is in Asia, and specifically East and Southeast Asia, and that's I would say a feature of this industry that makes for this, in a sense, lack of transparency towards investors, towards entrepreneurs, towards consumers, that a lot of the production occurs where at least the Western consumer really is not very knowledgeable. So all these warm water species would be farmed in these regions. For example, a shrimp or tilapia, you would find a lot of production in Asia. Then there are a few more local hotspots. So in South America, Chile is, as you already mentioned, farming a significant amount of salmon. Ecuador, for example, is producing a lot of shrimp. In Norway, there's a lot of salmon. In Egypt, there's a lot of tilapia production. Brazil is an up and coming aquaculture producer, scaling actually pretty quickly. But if you take a map and really place the largest aquaculture producers there, it would be China and other Southeast Asian and Asian countries, and then the rest of the world. So I think in the top 20 producing countries, really only a few are outside of Asia.
And how does that reflect, let's say, the work you do at Hatch Blue, and how does that shape that reality of that most of it is already out of sight, basically, because it's underwater or it's in ponds. It's not very visible. We're not sort of used to it because we still think fisheries, we put a fishing rod and that's how we get fish. And it's sort of a romantic idea. But how does it shape your work and your focus that most of it is in Southeast Asia, predominantly, let's say?
Yeah. So when we started, we were quite clear that despite being a small and young organization, we had to be global in our activities. And so we went and opened an office in Singapore. That was really within the first year, because we knew we had to be close to that industry. We also, for ourselves, really try to be on the ground, really go to these producers, go to the countries. We have published a few interesting reports that try to help people understand the reality of the farming side of things. So, for example, for the shrimp aquaculture industry, there's on shrimpfarm.tech a good overview of the industry there. Or for the seaweed industry, on seaweedinsights.com, we visited over 100 producers and really took a lot of pictures and a lot of videos and really tried to make it tangible. And for us, as you already mentioned, on the investor side, we have to do an educational piece. Of course, there are investors super knowledgeable, but for most parts, the global investing community is not knowledgeable on the sector. And it's changing, but it's changing slowly. And then on the entrepreneurial side, what we probably more than other VCs see is that you have a lot of innovation coming out of the well-funded regions, like the US, Canada, Europe, that are probably, they have good IP, they have strong capacities, but they don't really have the connection to the industry. And so we serve as a bridge for them we bring the problem statements often from the industry closer to them, and we help them then go into these markets to sell their offering there. And from a portfolio construction perspective, it's quite interesting because we need to balance these different type of entrepreneurs and these different business models. And it has been very interesting to see over the last 7-8 years, like which ones are working and which ones are not working. And I guess this could fill the whole podcast, which probably is not the best idea, but learned a lot.
I'm curious. Go ahead.
Just for example, the Asian industry with its scale is of course a prime target for VC investable business models, where you can bring a lot of users on the platform, but the companies that have been successful in doing that have been companies that were headquartered and founded there. So there were attempts of, let's say, Western companies to roll out their solutions in Asia, but the ones that succeeded, like for example a fishery, or in our portfolio an AquaConnect or a Jala, they were all local entrepreneurs.
I think eFishery is like the first unicorn, right?
Absolutely.
In this space.
Yeah, exactly. And that is due to the scale of the industry. But in order to grow these companies, you need the cultural knowledge and the understanding of the markets you're operating in. And then there were a few examples of companies that tried to do very similar things, but did struggle when they were not founded there. So that's one learning. But because it's also a B2B industry that we're operating in, most of the businesses that we invest in don't sell directly to a consumer. There are large players, the big agricultural commodity companies like Cargill or ADM, that are present in these markets. And so if you have the right innovation, if you have a good offering, you don't necessarily need to go directly to the farmers. Often you can sell it to the feed companies in particular, and they are present in these markets.
It's a fascinating insight, and I feel similar to the land-based, let's say, agriculture space, the ag tech space. We've seen a lot of excitement, investments, etc. Often not really connected to farmers on the ground, even though the farmers might be a few hundred miles or less away. Somehow, often, in this case, it's actually literally on the other side of the planet.
Right.
But that doesn't it doesn't give you a free out of jail card that you shouldn't really understand your customers.
100%.
And we often see agtech failing at that. Like farmers are not interested, don't have the capacity to buy it, or don't want to. Too complex. All these kind of, like the amount of money burned in agtech over the last decade is immense. Because of that issue of not being, you're saying the successful ones actually were homegrown and locally culturally based and were able to pull it off, which is a similar thing I think we see on the land-based side. You mentioned feed. So coming back to our mental picture, feed is an absolutely fundamental piece of aquaculture. Of course, not the seaweed side, because they eat as well, but they manage themselves. Also the bivalves, mussels, oysters, etc. You don't need to feed, but everything else needs feed. Just to start a conversation on feed, how do we introduce the topic of feed into our audience?
So it's definitely the most important input into aquaculture, except for, as you already said, those species that are not being fed. There's a seaweed, also the bivalves, like the oysters or the mussels. They don't need feeding; they feed naturally on plankton in the water. And then there are some species that you can choose to feed, but they also do fine if there's enough natural life in the ponds. Like a carp or tilapia. So most of the industry though is fed, and fed or the feed has a huge impact on the profitability of the business. In some cases, it's even 60 or 70% of the costs of farming, and in salmon it would be a little bit less because you have other costs, but still 40-50% of the total cost of farming. And secondly, and maybe even more importantly, it has a huge impact on the footprint of the product, because the feed ingredients that go into the feed, and to explain it maybe here quickly, the way it works is the feed companies have fairly large feed production plants where they source different ingredients, and there could be up to 80 different ingredients into one feed product. Then they mix it and they run it through an extruder or a pelleting machine and get one small pellet out on the other end, and those are backed up and shipped to the farms. And then I mentioned the ponds or the net pans. This is then where they would feed these pellets to the animals. And what goes into the feed is hugely important. And there historically has been a lot of usage of fish meal and fish oil, for example, because fish eat fish. That's the reality, and they need these high protein ingredients in there. But of course, that is not good, and so reducing the reliance on fish meal and fish oil.
Why is that not good? Just to where does fish meal and fish oil come from?
It's wild harvested, and often it's in countries that we don't have a whole lot of an understanding on what is happening. There, of course, MSC certified fish meal fisheries in Europe and in other parts of the world, but there's also a big portion of fish meal that comes from sources that we don't understand. And ideally, I personally would love to see a world in which we don't rely on any wild resources anymore to farm our food. But I don't think it is realistic at the moment, because the aquacultured animals, they require certain nutrient profile, and that's really hard to replace. But as an example, the usage of fish meal in the salmon industry has gone from about 30% of a feed to down to 11%, and has been gradually replaced through other ingredients, which also are not perfect, and the industry as a whole has grown. So overall, not less fish meal is being used, but the trend is clear that people are trying to phase out the use of these marine ingredients in aquaculture.
Yeah, so just to double click on that and to underline the not a romantic image, but we make this transition from hunter-gatherers to farming, and then we don't rely on fisheries anymore. That's not the case yet, or it's not the case. A lot of the especially smaller animals, smaller fishes are being harvested and grinded into fish meal, which is a more powder-like, or the oil side, because we're farming species that eat other fish, and they need those protein levels and they need those qualities. So there's actually, you could say, part of the aquaculture space is also driving part of the fishery space. So they're intimately connected. And there's an argument to make, like, why don't we eat those fishes directly instead of feeding it then through a salmon or another species? But feed is a hot topic. It's a fundamental topic from the environmental and the climate space, because it doesn't help your efficiency if you have to go out and fish a lot of fish oil and fish meal. And of course, from a fisheries and ocean perspective, it's a big lever that is there. And so the replacement, then there are a lot of other ingredients, up to 80 you mentioned. Also you wanted to go there, then I interrupted you to double click on the fish meal and fish oil piece. Also the other ingredients, you say, oh great, we replaced it with other things. It went from 30 to 11% in salmon, but also the other ones, of course, you don't get there are no free lunches. Also, they have their challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just before I go there, it's important to note that there are many different aquaculture species, and naturally, because of their biology, they have very different efficiencies in converting their feed into then the harvested product. And some of those are really efficient, and you don't require a lot of, or not even any, marine ingredients to produce product, and some are really inefficient, and you definitely can argue that we should not even be eating those. And that concept is called the feed conversion ratio, probably in agriculture a very similar thing. And
it took us 37 minutes to get to FCR, feed conversion ratio. That's
now we're here.
But it's a fundamental piece. Like, you see that in decks. I remember from Aquaspark the decks of what's the FCR, how much feed goes in to get a kilo of, etc., which we, of course, in agriculture, in land-based agriculture, also use in terms of the dairy sector, but predominantly the chicken, and it's always compared to chicken and beef, etc. And so it's a fundamental piece. People remember FCR, feed conversion ratio, but there the species selection is key, because some, as you said, are way more efficient, need way less or no marine. And then you suddenly get a very interesting protein source. Because why it's so important, we're growing protein here. It's not that you can do everything plant-based. Many people are dependent on protein, and fish might be one of the most, or is one of the most effective ones there. Plus they float, so they don't need a lot of energy to keep them moving, because they are in water. So FCR, people, very important, feed conversion ratio.
Very important. And then you can, of course, dive much deeper from there into things like a fish in, fish out ratio, and getting really more specific around the usage of these ingredients. But it's overall, FCR is super important. And just as an example, we are in a due diligence on a land-based producer. So in our world, land-based means that there's actually a land-based production system, and maybe we can go to that in a second. But we were doing due diligence on them, and we really requested over a few weeks even more and more information on the FCR, because to us it's such an important indicator on the performance, and it can range between the species, it can range within the species, between the production systems, or based on husbandry, based on the engineering of the system, and based on the genetics. So I would say that this is probably the EFCR, so the economic FCR, which also factors in the mortalities that occur during the production cycle, is definitely the most important indicator within aquaculture. And you ask, like, okay, now we're replacing fish meal and fish oil, and what are we replacing it with? And that really is an issue, because we are moving away from marine proteins and oils to terrestrially produced, agriculturally produced proteins and oils. So soy became a really important part of the diet, either soy meal or soy protein concentrate, which is a huge global commodity going into obviously also many other protein production sectors or directly into human consumption, but they go into aquaculture at large volumes. And I probably don't need to tell the audience here from investing in regenerative agriculture why we have issues with soy, and why we are also actively looking for alternatives to soy protein concentrate. But really we have been, or I think the industry has been struggling with adopting other ingredients for the last couple of years. I mean, when we started, we were like, okay, great, and then we're going to invest in insect proteins and algae proteins, and soon we will not have any fish meal anymore. Yeah, and the reality is that we're trying to compete in the case of fish meal with a commodity that is not pricing in the externalities of how it's caught. I would argue the same is true for most of soy protein concentrate, and it's a really cheap, high quality, really great. It's a really great ingredient, commodity that we're trying to outcompete with, and so you can only do that if you have at least the same level of quality and so specs, but you need to almost undercut the cost structure of what you're trying to outcompete, and that has been really a challenge for many players. So I would say there were or are currently a few hundred different insect protein producers. They all struggled to, maybe now it's not their strategy anymore, not their focus, but they've all struggled to produce at a price that is competitive. And for reference for the audience, a ton of fish meal, I would say right now is about $1,800 US. A ton of soy protein concentrate, depending on quality and location, maybe $900 a ton. So producing something that, in the case of insect meal, that is not as high quality as a fish meal, so you're rather looking at the price of soy that you're getting for your product. So producing that under $1,000 US a ton is not possible. Right now they're selling between $3,000 $3,500 a ton, and that really meant that they were not able to go into the aquaculture industry at a large scale. There's still applications of it, but it's not a large scale replacement. And so just to maybe point that out, we have spent a year looking for other alternatives with a colleague of mine, Linda, who really went super broad and then super deep to find the potential other replacements. And the long story short is to us that additional protein ingredients, at least, not talking about the oils, but protein, they still have to come from agriculture in the future, but we just need to make sure it is a better source than soy protein.
So this is a very clear connection between the land and the sea, and between land-based agriculture and land and sea-based or water-based aquaculture, where a lot of the ingredients coming to grow these species come from farms. And we don't have to unpack here why soy is an issue, or in many cases, but there's also a huge opportunity there to improve practices. So when we say a lot of it is going to animal feed, which is, I think, a piece we always see when we see land use statistics, actually a chunk of that goes to fish feed, to feeding fish, and not all of it goes to ruminants, etc. And how does how does a fish process or enjoy, let's say, the enjoy is not a word we should use here, or we could use here, but how well does land-based protein work for an aquatic-based animal?
There you always, at the end of the day, the fish needs nutrients. They don't need the ingredients. The fish doesn't really, or the shrimp doesn't really care where it comes from. But as I mentioned already, for example, the amino acid profile, so the mix of different amino acids within fish meal is fantastic for growing fish. I mean, evolutionary adopted to doing that, so that makes a lot of sense. There are then differences, for example, in the amino acid profiles of different vegetable proteins. There, especially for vegetable proteins, also there have been issues with anti-nutritional factors that are probably not only an issue with fish, but especially in soy and some others. Within the process, you need to make sure to remove them, and you probably still have an issue. And then there's to your question of what they enjoy. There is palatability, so they also need to like it, and especially the marine oils and proteins are liked by the marine ingredients, and so there could be a lack of that for the terrestrial proteins. And then there are other categories, for example, the single cell proteins, which is really the idea of growing bacterial biomass in fermenters at large scale and feeding that to the industry. Those typically don't have an issue with anti-nutritional factors based on everything we've seen so far, but they might have an issue of not all proteins or nitrogen in there being proteins for them to use to produce muscles. So yeah, those are then the specifics that you need to look at when you consider investing in a company or starting a company in this space. And obviously something that the industry has been doing for the feed industry has been doing that for many years, always testing the different ingredients, seeing what they can incorporate and what is not working.
And is there an interest or a drive or an incentive, let's say, for quality in that sense? Like you see a lot of discussion in of course, the land-based food and agriculture space on, or a lot we see in our little bubble, discussion on nutrient quality, nutrient density, like you are what what your food ate. And that's both true for vegetables and definitely also for animals. And so we see on grazing, on supplements, but also on chickens. We just had an interview go live with Dan Kittredge, where he said basically, the Bionutrient Food Association, I don't eat pork and chicken anymore because a lot of it is inflammatory because it was fed on a grain-fed diet. Even organic grain doesn't really make a huge difference there unless it's sprouted, unless it's fermented in a certain way, because chickens are not evolved to eat grain that much. And I know it's hit a nerve with some people. I saw the reactions on LinkedIn, etc. So is that kind of conversation, like the quality of the soy or the quality of the protein, how is that happening, if at all, in the aquaculture space?
The most important one, I would say, are the omega-3s, because from a consumer perspective, they eat the seafood often because of the nutritional benefits of getting omega-3s and into their diet. And as an example, like the omega-3 levels in farmed salmon have been dropping. The reason is quite simple. They are expensive to put into the feed, so the feed companies would put less into the feed unless the market would demand it. So there's no problem in terms of technically to produce a salmon that has comparable omega-3 levels to a wild salmon, but in reality, it's I would say about half of that, and I would expect it to drop further until the consumers again say, hey, we want more omega-3s in there. And one thing that I often come up against is also then people looking at mercury and other heavy metals and plastic, and that typically is not an issue with farmed fish, because it's just not this accumulation system that you have within wild fish. So it's not there, but in the consumer or from a perception perspective, it sometimes comes up. To answer your question on nutrient density, it's not a discussion in the industry beyond omega-3s, at least that I have not come across it, but I would think it will happen eventually, and I would expect that the results are similar to what you see on land. Would be my guess.
But I think already omega-3 and omega-6 discussions, the fact that we're having them in aquaculture is a huge piece. And you're saying many people eat fish because of the health pieces. It might already be a step ahead, at least in terms of the discussions we're having in land-based. I still remember the reason why Bleu Blanqueur in France exists, which is certification for mostly animal protein, but now also going into vegetables, is because they saw the soy coming in for feed for animals, and they were wondering what it did to the quality of pig meat, but also cow and dairy, etc. And they started measuring, because omega-6-3 ratio is easy. Apparently, I don't have a lab, so I don't know. But apparently that's an easy indicator of what the animal ate, and you can see it very quickly. And it's interesting that it's one of the drivers, or at least a piece of a driver of the aquaculture space, which is absolutely not in the agriculture space, except for one certification body in France. And so that might be an interesting, at least step ahead, or an interesting, because it is a topic. People are in fish. People are talking omega-3/6, wild versus this, that versus that, etc., etc. The fatty part is important, and all of those good things.
Absolutely, and there has been more success in replacing the omega-3s or the DHA and the EPA with non-marine sources in the industry than there have been in terms of replacing the protein, because the fermented algae that especially two companies are selling, they have been working out, and in recent months then also there has been a huge change in fish oil price, and that gave them an additional boost. But this is something we're definitely seeing, some commercial adoption of algae-based alternatives to fish oil, especially for DHA and EPA, which is encouraging.
Sorry, those two acronyms, what do they stand for, and why are they important?
They're the omega-3s. They're the omega-3s and omegas. The EPA is the precursor of the DHA, which is the omega-3 that we mostly care about.
Okay, no, just for the people in the back to keep track of what we're talking here. And so from an investment perspective, on the feed side, and we're going to cover a wide range of companies in the coming months and have deep dives on that. But from you, like putting your investor hat on, what do you look at? What is interesting? You very clearly made a case for insect protein isn't there yet and might never be. But it's I think because it's interesting, because that might have been a deck that people also not in the aquaculture space have seen. You've got like, oh, it makes so much sense, feeding insects with food waste or with something, and they're so efficient and all of that. And you make a very clear case. Look at the price and look what it replaces. And unless you have an industry that can reach a sub $1,000 per ton, it won't be going anywhere. But then you're mentioning fermented algae, that replacing a very specific piece. And of course, there you need way less ton, and you are doing something else. So from an investor perspective, what kind of framework, what kind of questions should we think about when we look at the feed side of things? Because it seems a fundamental piece of aquaculture.
So I would ask, as you said already, price and cost structure. I think ultimately when prices are then going more to the lower part of the range, then where your cost structure is super important. Then does it meet the nutritional requirements of the industry? And often those are then proven by feeding trials. That there are various different trials you can do. It's fairly straightforward, I would say, and typically the early stage companies would have maybe done one at a small scale, and it's an early indication. There's also literature you can typically use to say, okay, can we expect it to work? And then is a scale, and that one is super important for us, because if you look at producing like 500 tons of feed ingredient, you're not going to be relevant in a global industry. So there has been historically this benchmark of saying, okay, you need to produce at least 40,000 tons to be relevant to feed companies. That's not true. That's definitely too much. But you need to show a path of getting to a few thousand tons then, and maybe even that you have potential to go beyond that, because otherwise it's not a relevant ingredient from the feed company perspective. And in order to get to scale, of course, like, what's your capex per ton of installed capacity? Where are you getting your inputs to produce it from? Is that a stable supply of both in terms of the quality, but also in terms of the volumes throughout the season? And is the process in place to transform it? If you need a lot of innovative technology to take it from A to B, then you just, as an investor can expect a lot of challenges while the company is upscaling, and you have to take some of these risks for sure. But this is roughly the framework that I use when I look at these ingredient companies.
And this is a regenerative aquaculture series. So, and we've had conversations about this. We're going to cover it in other episodes as well. But like the regenerative principles on diversity, on regeneration. We're opening a whole different area now of the podcast. But when you think about that, when you look into that, what excites you? What do you see in terms of potential in the aquaculture sector, which is very similar but also very different than land-based farming, let's say soil-based farming? What comes to mind when you think about the principles and the principles of regeneration?
So inherently, I think aquaculture is in a good position, because we already mentioned that there are some species that don't require feed, such as the bivalves, so the mussels and the oysters. There's some or the seaweeds, and most of them are grown in the open ocean. Still in protected areas, but really these growing systems provide habitat provisioning services to the ecosystem. So really it's a kindergarten for the young animals. It's a protective shelter also for biodiversity.
So from a regeneration perspective, it's best to go in that area of the aquaculture space. From a health perspective, like you mentioned, mercury and microplastics, how worried should I be with bivalves? Just asking for myself and family.
Bivalves, not so much for mercury, and because they are not accumulating over a long period of time, but bivalves, because they're filter feeders, can bring harmful algae and any sort of bacteria or toxin that would be in the waterway. So it's important that it's being monitored, and it is for the industry. And as a producer, it can be a risk. If you have your, let's say your mussels growing in a certain area and there is a period of harmful algae blooms, then you can't bring your product to market. And I can tell you from my personal experience, I had some of these toxins, and it's not pretty. That is something. But those were not through aquaculture produced products. That was through my own fault of eating them from the wild. But with a good monitoring system, you definitely get rid of those issues. And then from a health perspective, generally they're regarded as a healthy source of protein. Yeah, the mussels or the oysters. I would think they're, if the world would eat more of those, that would be fantastic. But of course, as an investor, we have to be also realistic and say, do we expect different markets to increase their consumption of these significantly? No, not really. But for seaweed, for example, it's a different story, because a lot of people are working on new markets, new applications for seaweed, and they roughly have the same benefits in the right production systems. Yeah, I think that always needs to be the caveat, is like, if you just put a lot of seaweed farms, a lot of mussels farm into one bay, that's also not a good idea. Yeah, as always. So it's always about the right production system, for the location, for the species. But then you really can have these benefits of abundance increase, of biodiversity increase, that are scientifically proven. Not easy to prove, but proven. And when you then, in the case of seaweed, also open up new applications, new markets, there's really a reason for people to, in theory, be excited about seaweed as a regenerative aquaculture investment. And I'm also interested in some of the other bivalve species from a regenerative perspective. And maybe lastly, what people don't really, I think, on the agricultural side, wouldn't really include into a definition of regenerative, but it's almost the other side of the flow is the nitrogen and phosphorus. Yeah, and the seaweed and the bivalves, they're great at cleaning up the waterways, and often they are in estuaries there where the rivers go into the ocean, and there they take out excessive nitrogen, excessive phosphorus, and that can be measured how much they took out. And this is something we include in our definition of regenerative, because it has this pollutant removal effect.
Yeah, there's another very intimate connection between land-based, soil-based farming and ocean-based or water-based farming, where the runoff, which we of course need to drastically reduce with different practices, we all know, or many have seen examples of what happens if you do that differently. But the reality is most farms haven't, which means there is a lot of runoff, and there's a lot of excess nutrients going into waterways and ending up in the ocean, and potentially being which with disastrous consequences for the oceans. Meaning, how do we filter? And we happen to have some amazing sources of protein that actually do that not for free, but you can also sell them, which is interesting, or which is a unique piece. And then beyond that, because we're going to cover seaweed for sure, because it's sort of captivating the minds and hopefully also wallets of some people, and they're interesting biostimulants. Actually, for soil, we have some very exciting, or farmers that are very excited about certain seaweeds somehow as fertilizer replacements or biostimulants and things like that. Of course, there's the seaweed side of things in ruminants, which I don't know we'll cover, but it's the methane discussion. There's seaweed for cosmetics, for health, for a lot of interesting applications for biofuels. We've seen it all. It seems definitely interesting to double click on that. But if you go beyond that and say you're saying as well, like, okay, seaweed might be an exception in the sense, like the bivalves, how much we need a cultural change to eat many more of those. So definitely everybody listening contribute to that, but that's not going to change overnight. Seaweed might have that potential because of certain industries and certain qualities it has. But if we go to, let's say, the animal side of farming, of course, a mussel is also an animal, but the ones that move more, where do you see like regenerative principles or thinking? How do you apply it there? Mm-hmm. What should we think about when we approach that part of the sector, which is massive, obviously, compared to bivalves globally?
So what the trend is that we focus more on reducing the the harm that those production systems do to the environment. Yeah, and I think it's very important to also be clear on what the downsides are, and how to get a hold of those. And so, for example, for net pen aquaculture, there's no collection system for the feces or the fat or the feed that was fed too much. Yeah, there's that then has an impact in terms of nutrient load on the environment. If it's in a high energy, a high current zone, then that's probably not such a huge issue. But if it's in a lake or in a body of water where you have less water exchange, it really can have an impact on the benthic environments, on the environment below the cage. If in the salmon industry, there's a huge issue of one parasite in particular, the sea lice, which is not killing salmon, but it is going from there to wild population, and that really is an issue. And therefore, there's regulation in place that it's removed from the salmon, and salmon is treated, and that in turn then increases mortality, because all of these treatment events have increase the stress on the fish, can add wounds to some fish. So there are these localized challenges, not like talking about where the feed or so is coming from, right? But really what the footprint locally is. And the trend there is generally to reduce the footprint, and the most common currently invested in and pushed forward solutions are to either move it on land. Yeah, so really it can be near the water, but it can also be really in landlocked area, and there would be a big production hall, and you walk in and it's a bit humid, and there are big tanks and pumps and filters, and the fish are within the tanks, and either it's fully circulating, then it's called a RAS system, a recirculating aquaculture system, or it's a flow-through system, so it's still pumping water from the ocean, pumping it through those tanks and then pumping it back out, but allows to control what is going in and what is going out. And then there's a trend, especially pushed forward by Norwegian companies on the contained system side. So they are still floating in the water, but now they are closed off to various degrees. So there you then have no or almost no issue with sea lice. You can control what goes out of the system again, but overall they're much more expensive. So they also have a challenge to scale. And then there are some people submerge cages nowadays, so really get rid of the sea lice issue in salmon, and in some parts of China that's also working well for some species. And then there are these offshore systems, really the idea of taking it so far offshore that, given the carrying capacity of the environment there, the issues are completely diluted. But they have engineering and operational challenges, because we're talking about huge systems in 10 meters of waves and gale force storms, and of course you need a different type of production system to withstand that, and a different type of operational schedule. So those are broadly the approaches, and they, I would say, are not focusing on increasing the regenerative potential of it, but they're more focusing on reducing the harmful effects. Like on land, it would be something like fertilizer usage or erosion, or So
it's fascinating to see the parallels. With land-based and the issues of pesticides, or the issue of pests, and pesticides and issues of closing, but it's also in a very different space still, because there is so much space in the oceans. Of course, not easy, because you're in, if you're like 10-meter waves, etc., will destroy almost everything. But there is so much space that also, and it's your soil, in this case, the water flows through. So if there's enough of the water, and if you're far away enough from other places, then it doesn't have no effect, obviously, because the amount of feed you throw in and it's not being eaten will go somewhere. The amount of feces, of course, but the ocean is so big that there's still a lot of space and time before you hit those walls. And we've hit those walls with agriculture a long time ago. Like there is no other land. We're actually losing the land, and we're cutting more forest and rainforest in many places. So there's a whole different tension and dynamic where there is competing for space. And this, of course, also competes for space because you have certain bays that are perfect, but there is still a lot of other maneuverability too. But it also has an issue, or it's a potential, like these feces and feed, etc. You don't really see it because it's the bottom of the pan. It can take quite a while before this becomes visible, and that's probably, and this is an industry that's not followed so much as agriculture and not hotly debated. So it also, you can get away longer probably with things than in agriculture, and that will change. I mean, locally, of course, there's a lot of protest, there's a lot of pushback to certain systems, and then this whole movement to fully indoor, fully controlled is what we see as well with plants in vertical farms and things like that, just to get us as close to a fully controlled system where you can do exactly what you want and have the full control, which we now of course know that never exactly happens, but as much as control as you hope you can have.
And there's certainly then the question of, do you really want to move a whole system further in that direction, which maybe terrestrial agriculture has also shown where the challenges are. Yeah, I think there are a couple of interesting comparables, also really distinct differences between the land-based or the terrestrial agriculture and aquaculture. Yeah, because there's no soil in that sense. There's a wider body of water, that is really important to the health, but there's no soil, and therefore I see in the regenerative agriculture space investment models that connect to the value of the land over a longer period of time. Within regenerative aquaculture, that's not really possible. The only thing that is valuable in some cases is the license itself. But really, this is only valuable so far in the salmon industry, where there's a limit on the licenses and a huge value from each license. And so there's not this inherent connection for farmers to take care of their soil, but also these aquatic environments, they move so quickly. With one tide you move whatever excuse my language, but whatever shit you put out, you move up and down the entire coast. And so what we have seen is that then if there are too many farms, for example, in one area, and it goes beyond the carrying capacity of the whole area, then everyone is impacted. And so there are cases, farms I have visited in Thailand, shrimp farms that say, we crashed after we had too many farms here, and now we have fewer farms because it doesn't work. But getting a group of farmers to apply different practices is, I would think, even harder than to getting individual farmers to adopt these practices. So I think this different character of regenerative aquaculture means that we cannot transfer all learnings from regenerative agriculture over to regenerative aquaculture, but certainly, as you pointed out, there's some clear similarities.
And then, to be conscious of our time as well, I want to end with two questions we always like to ask in the general in the podcast. And of course, we can adjust them slightly to life below water. Let's say, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing overnight in the let's say the food sector, let's make it nice and broad, what would that be?
I would definitely change the way we source the feed for the animals we're producing, and I would keep it broad. Often aquaculture is actually the place where some of these innovations start because you have higher price points per ton of feed, but I certainly would would love to see alternatives to especially soya. And we're working on it, yeah, but it's really not an easy game. It's really long-term, slow, and you're competing with a massive industry.
Yeah, that sounds like what many listeners are doing, I think, in other places. It's maybe not the feed industry, but it's the input industry, or it's the fossil fuel industry, which is also basically feed or input. But it's definitely very entrenched. Maybe slightly less in aquaculture because it's slightly younger, but also in land-based farming, we see the last 50, 60 years, in most places at least, the intrinsic, the industrialization, and definitely the wrong side of that, taking hold and basically moving all agency or power away from farmers and land or sea stewards in general. And we see the effects now of that. And then you raised a significant amount of money, but nowhere near the $1 billion I always like to ask. So if you had $1 billion to put to work, would it all go into feed alternatives? Would it go into, I don't know, sea-based tractors for seaweed? What would you focus on if you had complete freedom over time and space? It could be extremely long-term investments. What would you focus on if you had a lot of money to put to work?
I think I would probably focus on cracking a couple of these chicken and egg problems, where you, in the case, for example, of seaweed, you need the market applications in order for more supply to be there. And my opinion is that you could brute force it with a lot of capital, which unfortunately, as you said, we don't yet have. But the same is actually true for feed ingredients too. Like there are no most of the time there are no binding offtake agreements, so that really makes it hard for the companies to scale up. But with enough capital, this could be taken care of, and I would put some of it towards the truly, in our opinion, regenerative farming practices like the seaweeds. For sure, I would, as I mentioned, definitely try to reduce scope 3 emissions from feed, so look for better feed ingredients, and then put the remaining third towards changing the production system itself, where we for the existing industry to really move it away from net pen and pond-based aquaculture towards these more or towards these better solutions of, for example, land-based or contained systems.
And do you see, like, it's a young industry, always like the last question leads to other questions, but like there's, from my time in this space, which was short and 10 years ago plus, but it always felt like questions on sustainability, on, of course, now regeneration, but let's say sustainability, were important, but it also felt as fast-growing industry that could always just point at FCR and say, look, we're way better than beef, we're way better than chicken. Of course, it depends. There's a lot of nuance to that, but sort of that was good enough, or that was okay. Has that shifted? Has that changed? Like, is there a deeper conversation on sustainability, not just in the Hatch Blue offices, of course, but do you feel as a sector, which was new and everything seemed to be going to the stars and the moons because it was growing so fast, or is growing so fast, and not hitting the limits yet, let's say, what's the conversation like, let's say, around these deeper questions? Because you don't want to set up a system that is slightly better or significantly better, but still not good enough. And then you be left with a lot of infrastructure that is basically not stranded, but sets you up in a path in a certain direction that we see with transition fuel like natural gas, which is the best. It's just fossil fuel gas. Let's not call it natural, but it sets it up for a path, and we're locked in for another 10, 20 years in certain things that we should just not want. What do you, very big open question, but like how are those conversations happening if in the aquaculture space?
I would say they're quite prominent, maybe not on the system level, like really are we building the wrong system and are then locked in, but I would say the industry is quite aware and of its challenges, and it's also trying to address those, but very often you would end up with a with the question, okay, whose ultimate responsibility is it? Well, is it for the consumers to accept a higher price for the product, or is it for the big ag to provide different solutions? And we've just basically seen what the reality is, that at least from our perspective, that there is not a big portion of the global population that pays a premium for sustainability, and that the big industry will always point to what the market demands. So pushes the responsibility down the supply chain. Of course, there are players that generally try to act differently and really push forward. But those questions are for sure coming up, where we then say, okay, let's focus on the things we can do within these boundaries or constraints right now, and try to shift that, and not focus on things that are completely outside of our control. But there are certainly also topics that I think are not well enough understood, and as you saw, it's actually all connected. Like it's from the land into the sea, back on the land with biostimulants. So I think because it's complex, and because we humans don't like complexity, we try to simplify it, and naturally there are certain areas that we have not yet discussed and brought into the dialogue. But my feeling is a little bit that the industry is discussing more than I think some others are. And it could be because overall it's still a more high-end or more valuable product than maybe corn or wheat or like soy in itself is, and therefore you're a bit closer to some consumers that care and push for that conversation, or I'm wrong and it's the same across agriculture and aquaculture.
I think it's a perfect end to this conversation, this intro, but it's not an intro. It's the basics, the challenges, the opportunities. We only scratched not literally, the surface. There are so many rabbit holes we could, of course, fall into. And we will do that over the next episodes. I want to thank you, Georg, so much for coming on here, for helping to shape this series, actually, for kicking it off, for giving us the idea as well, like how to apply regeneration to aquaculture. What should people know? What should people watch out for? It definitely came from conversations we had. And so I want to thank you so much for being here for the first one, and setting the stage, and setting people up for probably looking at fish, water, and a lot more very differently after this episode and the ones to come.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. That was a real pleasure, and I'm really glad to see that you're paying more tribute to that industry. I think it's part of the agricultural industry at the end of the day, and I'm super glad that you're fostering this discussion.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time.